Coming up on this week's episode of Shadow Talk, we will be discussing the return of Gootloader malware with fresh SEO poisoning campaigns, a previously undiscovered Android spyware named LANDFALL that's deployed via a zero-day vulnerability, how pro-Russian hackers are using Linux virtual machines to hide in Windows environments, and finally, we'll run through the key cyber trends from Q3 2025 sector by sector. You'll learn which sectors have been the most impacted by ransomware groups, which sectors are most at risk from impersonating domains or exposed credentials, and most importantly, what to do about it all. I'm Kim, a Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst here at ReliaQuest, as well as the host of Shadow Talk. And joining me for the news this week is Corey Carter, a systems security engineer here at ReliaQuest, but his experience as a detection researcher, security analyst, and threat hunter, combined with his military background, equips Corey with a unique perspective on cybersecurity challenges. Hey Corey, how's it going?
Hey Kim, things are going well. Appreciate you leading off with that. It was a great day off yesterday for Veterans Day. So looking forward to being on the pod again.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you back. Diving straight in then. So after a 7-month hiatus, the infamous malware Gootloader has returned. Gootloader's operators have allegedly exploited over 100 compromised websites using SEO poisoning to lure victims searching for keywords like form and agreement. Users who visited the compromised pages were then directed to download zip archives, which were presented as legitimate documents. But those archives actually contained malicious JScript payloads that, when executed, established initial access and allowed for follow-on attacks. In this new campaign, Gootloader was exhibiting some interesting evasion techniques. So those archives would appear as regular text files if they were analyzed using any non-Windows tools, so like VirusTotal or any Python-based utilities. Visitors were also screened based on their location, their operating system, the source of their traffic, and the time of day that they were visiting the pages. So any of those that didn't fit within Gootloader's target audience then received benign AI-generated blog posts instead of the malicious payload. The operators also replaced Latin characters with Cyrillic characters to obscure their attack infrastructure. And all of that was done to exploit traditional gaps in defense tools. So traditional endpoint detection solutions analyze suspicious files using non-Windows analysis frameworks normally for efficiency and speed, which may mean that they are misclassifying Gootloader's archives as benign text files rather than malicious executables. Gootloader's persistence mechanisms have also changed, and they're using chained shortcut files rather than relying solely on scheduled tasks. And this shift is increasing detection timelines for companies, as these techniques will often operate outside the visibility of scheduled task monitoring. So this was an interesting one because while it wasn't the most active, Gootloader was a very prominent malware within our customer base back in 2024. And so its return means that it's likely to become one of maybe 2026's top initial access malware in circulation. And it's likely that the operators of Gootloader are going to continue into next year conducting high volume social engineering to target professionals with access to critical systems and sensitive data.
Yeah, well said, Kim. You hit on two of the characteristics that I thought were new and novel to this campaign. The first one being the zip file containing two files within, right? Like one malicious, one benign. That's kind of key. And going back, like Gootloader and Sock Ghoulish, like they want to make it as difficult as possible for threat researchers to get their hands on these samples. So, those Latin characters, if you're running something like a live hunt in VirusTotal where you're looking for keywords and like certain file types, like it's going to be difficult to capture samples to kind of dig into further. Digging in a little deeper to that second characteristic that I thought was interesting is the persistence through the two LNK files, right? Like those are link files, they're window shortcuts. And they're going to be dropped in the startup folder. So that way, every time you restart your computer, it runs, as well as the app data folder. But was really interesting to me was in the app data folder, the way that that is executed is they actually create a custom hotkey combination. And that is actually triggered by simulated keystrokes performed by the JavaScript file. So really interesting characteristics and techniques that they're using nowadays. As far as detections go, the basic is going to be looking for a zip archive. So a zip file containing a JavaScript file in downloads folder. And you can look through your command line auditing tools. So EDRs or 4688s. So having the combination of a commonly abused folder, downloads, public, as well as a command line containing zip and .js, it's going to at least get you some indication that is going on. So yeah, I thought this one was interesting. I also liked how in the article there is a researcher that states his activities led to the Gootloader operation suddenly ceasing in March 31st of 2025. So about 6 months ago, like you alluded to. Could you imagine being a single individual that pesters an operation so much that they just shut down? So for all those out there that don't think they can make a difference by themselves, like this is proof that you can.
Yes, I love that. Love that ending. And no, don't give up the good fight, as they say. Well, Corey, I'll hand back over to you to introduce our next topic.
Yeah, so for our next topic, so Palo Alto's Unit 42 identified a new spyware family dubbed LANDFALL, and it's been targeting individuals in the Middle East with Samsung Android devices. So bottom line up front, LANDFALL was embedded in malicious image files, specifically .dng, and they're sent via WhatsApp. So to exploit a mobile device, you typically need to daisy chain vulnerabilities. The way that this daisy chain worked is the attacker would send a WhatsApp message containing a URL to a malicious DNG file. The vulnerability was in the WhatsApp media processing module, and that's automatically going to reach out to the URL. That's going to trigger a heap overflow vulnerability and download that malicious DNG file. Now, the malformed DNG file that was just retrieved would actually load an exploited vulnerability in Samsung's image processing to extract and execute the spyware. So WhatsApp was crucial in this delivery, as well as the vulnerability in Samsung's Android image processing layer. Now, I wouldn't say this is necessarily new. We've seen this in April, but I have a feeling we're going to continue seeing this. So in September, another vulnerability was released targeting the same image processing in Android. And back in August, a very similar vulnerability was released for macOS products that was also targeting the image processing layer. I honestly foresee in the future that we're going to start seeing much more mobile device exploitation that's going to lead to extortion. You know, with this spyware, they're downloading images, downloading text messages. So could you imagine being out there, you have one of these devices, someone sends you a random WhatsApp message that you don't know, so you delete the message, but you're already exploited. Someone's funneling all your data to their servers and then reaches out to you on your cell phone number. Hey, I have access to all your images. Here is an image out there that I'm sure you wouldn't want getting out there to your coworkers. So I need you to send me X amount of money to this, Bitcoin wallet or whatever it might be. So that's definitely a new tactic and maybe a new fear moving forward.
Yeah, you're right. This is something we've seen a lot within the kind of government espionage arena, with going after non-governmental bodies, researchers, that kind of thing. But it has the potential, as you say, to expand into a much broader concerning threat, and the ability of advanced threat actors to leverage 0 days. We know that's there. They do it all the time. So if we have that shift over to mobile, then that's going to increase the risk for both corporate users and individual users no end. Coupled with the advanced evasion techniques that we've seen in this campaign as well, it's going to really reveal the growing gap in mobile threat detection capabilities as well.
Yeah, definitely I'm glad you called that out. It's definitely a gap in mobile threat detections. Like you got to think most mobile devices out there, they don't have an or an antivirus running. They don't have like EDR telemetry feeding back in. So that being said, though, if you are an enterprise company out there, I think at minimum you should try to incorporate mobile app management. I know mobile device management is a huge lift, not only cost but also like time. A lot of headaches come with it, but mobile app management, if you're an O365 shop out there, it's going to limit the impact somewhat. You're going to limit the ability to copy text out, to screenshot certain data. So if you're an enterprise out there and you're a CISO especially, talk to your systems team and see what the level of effort it would be to do something like mobile app management. I think it's a good place to start before you kind of go the mobile device management route.
Yeah, definitely that kind of restricting of copying, pasting from corporate apps on personal devices is a must. Moving on then to our final topic of this week, a pro-Russian threat group known as COMrades has been observed using Linux-based virtual machines to hide their activities from Windows endpoint security tools. These threat actors, their goals have aligned strongly with espionage and long-term covert access rather than anything disruptive or potentially financial motivated, hence the alignment with the Russian state. So in this attack chain, the attackers are compromising Windows devices before exploiting legitimate virtualization technologies to gain persistence. They enabled the Hyper-V role to download a lightweight Linux virtual machine, which hosted the group's custom reverse shell, which is named Curly Shell, and a reverse proxy for managing traffic tunneling named curlcat. So by using the lightweight Linux virtual machine, COMrades can bypass many traditional EDR products and better obfuscate its activities than if it were to use anything that was placed directly on the host device. And all malicious outbound traffic then appears legitimate. The group also used 2 PowerShell scripts in its campaign, one to inject a Kerberos ticket into the LSAS for remote authentication and command execution, and another which creates a local account across domain-joined machines likely to achieve persistence. So while the components within this campaign are not new, the combination of all these techniques represents, and I quote, a significant and concerning evolution in attacker tactics.
Yeah, interesting to see this for sure. We're probably dealing with an APT group if you're seeing this level of persistence in a environment. We got to be thinking long-term access here, right? I've actually seen this. It was except it was a Windows VM running on a Windows host, but back in my threat hunting days or doing breach response, it makes it extremely confusing trying to identify the true source of this activity, right? There's going to be a visibility gap between the EDR running on the host and what is actually going on within the virtual machine. There's also a common technique that pen testers use, to be honest, to try to hide a lot of their activities so they don't get caught up in EDRs. To identify this activity, we're looking for PowerShell batch scripts. They're going to need to install the virtualization software unless they're using Hyper-V, which comes default on Windows Server. But they're also going to need to launch the VM and then call back home. So we need to be looking for command lines that contain common, either virtualization drivers or PowerShell interacting and configuring Hyper-V. I don't think these are extremely common out there. And if you do have endpoints that do use this, it's probably limited risk to exclude those from your detection, but also detection in depth is going to help us here, right? We're hoping to catch C2 or follow-on activity like network recon, like you were alluding to earlier.
Yeah, definitely. And we've seen in previous ransomware campaigns where they're conducting cross-platform attacks. So I think this interaction between Linux and Windows in order to bypass those traditional fences is something we're going to see more and more.
Absolutely. And also bring in Linux into the network and having a Linux machine. there and usually is like your jump box. It provides a lot of tooling, and it's also easier to get tooling, on the host. So yeah, a lot of adversaries, pen testers out there, they prefer Linux for follow-on operations once they make it in a network. So I definitely think we'll continue to see more and more of this.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Gray Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Joining us now is Hayden, who is another Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst here at ReliaQuest. Hayden is skilled in analyzing adversary TTPs and operationalizing this information, and has experience in intrusion response, OSINT investigations, and offensive security. Welcome back, Hayden.
Hey, Kim. Thank you so much for having me back on. Happy to be here.
Of course, we're happy to have you back. Now, we recently published a series of sector reports internally that run down the top cyber threats by sector from Q3 2025. These reports dive into ransomware trends, how different sectors are responding to cyber threats, the top digital risk protection alerts that we're sending out for these sectors, the top MITRE techniques that we're seeing in customer environments, and also prominent developments within the cyber criminal landscape. And with Hayden now, we are going to run through some of the key differentiators by sector. So first up, Hayden, can you run through some of the top ransomware trends that we've seen? And are there any really noticeable differances amongst industries?
Yeah, definitely. So first, kind of hitting on the similarities. So top groups leading right now, Keelan, Ink Ransom, Akira. They've been the top leading group since the fall of Ransom Hub several months ago. These groups are operated as like public or semi-public ransomware as a service groups, meaning that they have affiliate models where they're like Keelan being an open recruiting. So they just got more manpower on their end, where some of the other ones that we're going to talk about here, they'll be more of a closed group to where they keep very tight-knit operations. But as far as differences within the sectors, so first one that stood out to me was public administration sector. That one being with Interlock, a newer group, being in fourth place. They were not prominent elsewhere as far as each sector. And with this group, a little bit's really known about them. So first one being that their main method of obtaining initial access, being, of course, compromising or authenticating through VPNs, which will be a common theme throughout this. But another one is they're known to conduct drive-by downloads with the click fix method. So that being the social engineering technique that tricks users into thinking that they got to go through like a CAPTCHA, copy and paste a malicious command, such as like PowerShell into the terminal, which actually downloads the next stage of malware. And then from there, very similar techniques to other ransomware groups. So such as like your living off the land techniques, as we call it, such as using like tools and utilities within the environment that's already present, and then abusing service accounts to actually escalate privileges. It's also known for Interlock that they targeted healthcare earlier this year as well. So really going after specific sort of sectors, it seems like has been a theme with them. And then the last sort of call out I wanted to have with Interlock is they're known to deploy Oyster malware. So that looks like legitimate software that's packaged with the malicious DLL. We actually saw this about like 5 or 6 months ago, to where there was fake Microsoft Teams website to go to thinking you're downloading a legitimate file. But moving on from there, the next sector that I want to call out was the accommodations and food services. A group that stood out there, it's called Direwolf, which is possibly a closed group, and they emerged in around May of this year. And they're also known to conduct double extortion. I thought one interesting thing with this group is when they first emerged, they specifically targeted Taiwan and Thailand earlier this year. So very prominent around those geographies. And not much is really known as far as their TTPs with this group, unfortunately, as far as public reporting goes. And the last sector I kind of want to call out is the arts and entertainment sector. So one group that stood out there was Dark Army, which was in fourth place as far as listings. So again, they were seen earlier this year, and a different thing that stood out with them is they're known to conduct just extortion as opposed to stealing data and encrypting systems. So they just steal data and then conduct extortion from there. And their affiliate model is a little bit different, which is pretty interesting. So they actually have a base pay salary, and then any extortion proceeds that they receive is then split 50% with the group as well. Again, not much reporting on their exact TTPs. I have seen some researchers on different social media platforms actually discussing the legitimacy of some of their extortion attempts, of what the actual data that they have, which is actually kind of a good call out too. If you're an organization and then you're on the receiving end of extortion, definitely try to look through the sample data that they have to see if it's even relevant or if it's maybe just a rehash of older data. We've seen that with groups to where public data that's out there or maybe previously breached data, they'll try to obtain that and then reconduct extortion based off of it too.
Yeah, that's a good call out. And I think that's an interesting group to call out as well, because I think, the ransomware scene has changed quite a bit in the last year into now more of these groups who are just conducting extortion, and they kind of get bucketed under the ransomware header, if you like, but they're not actually ever deploying any ransomware payload. So it's good to call out and make that distinction, as you say. So for the killing group, we know that they are the most active throughout the entirety of 2025. And I think they were the group that was targeting most of our sectors predominantly. So what would you recommend in terms of mitigation steps to counter the threat from killing?
Yeah. So with Kalen, they are the most prominent affiliate group. So essentially, you're running Keelan as your franchise and you're recruiting your employees or your operators on the bottom end. So it's really the operators that have their own specific sort of TTPs and methods, which they will also bring to other groups too. So with Keelan, with that group, I suggest just kind of looking at ransomware as a whole, as far as those double extortion schemes and how they operate, because those, affiliates will take their TTPs to other providers as well too. But as far as like the most common overlaps that we see in those, of course, like your most common MITRE techniques that stand out. So of course, like, phishing with malicious links, phishing with malicious attachments, drive-by downloads, like as we talked about, and targeting of external remote services. And as far as the overall end goal of them, of course, is they want to gain access to that on-premise network. From there, stealing data, deploying ransomware, of course. They might do this by gaining domain admin access across the environment to be able to have that large deployment of ransomware, to have that very impactful deployment, to be able to have the most fruitful like extortion from there as well. And as far as these ransomware groups, one thing with them, as far as gaining initial access that we actually saw last year from our ATR report, is they mostly targeted VPN portals. Of course, either trying to authenticate to them or leveraging vulnerabilities to gain access to them. Those was the most successful methods that we saw. And of course, once they actually gain access to those VPN portals, they're operating without a agent on their host. They don't have EDR and so forth deployed on it, but they have access to the network there. So they have sort of more control and more leeway throughout the network. And as far as other TTPs on them, we know that they very heavily target service accounts to actually escalate their privileges in the environment. We actually do have one write-up that goes pretty in depth in this. It's titled "How Poorly Secured Service Accounts Lead to Breaches." So that actually goes into some in-depth recommendations there. But if they can't target those, as we know, they'll try to pivot and go after like domain admins, like I said earlier.
Yeah, well said, Hayden. I also wanted to add two things that stuck out to me as I was reading through these sector reports. One, the mean time to contain, right? That we saw that reduced to 6 hours and 26.8 minutes. It was previously reported as 7 hours and 43.8 minutes. So I have a feeling as our customers continue to adopt our gray matter platform, that as we identify true positives, we're going to start immediately containing those threats. And that is a direction that we need to get to as an organization, but two, like an entire sector. Like the entire sector needs to start getting bought in on automation. It's not acceptable nowadays to have an alert fire over the weekend. You say, oh, I'll get to it on Monday, sure. But what if that 2-day dwell period allows someone to further infiltrate your environment, right? So now we're to a point to where, hey, if our agent thinks, or if our platform thinks it's a true positive, we're just going to contain those threats off the rip. So I definitely think that's the direction we're trending, and I can hope to continue seeing that mean time to contain driven further down. The second item that I wanted to bring up was the Microsoft 365 Direct Send exploitation. I know we cover this in the information sector report, and we also talked about it briefly, I think it was back in September on Shadow Talk, but this is one that I have a feeling is slipping through the cracks in a lot of organizations, and it's allowing your users to get phished. You might have something like Proofpoint that sits in front of your 365 Exchange server. But with Microsoft 365 Direct Send, those emails are going to get through and completely bypass Proofpoint. So one, I recommend reviewing your 365 configuration to see if you have Direct Send enabled. Does it need to be enabled? What is the process like for enabling direct connections? So I would just highly recommend individuals out there review your 365 Direct Send, because sometimes you get emails, they come through Proofpoint, and then DMARC just breaks because now the email is forwarded from the individual's Exchange server to Proofpoint to your 365 Exchange server, and because the email didn't originate from the individual sender's Exchange server, it breaks DMARC because Proofpoint was in the middle. So there can definitely be complications here, and email routing and security is an art and a science all on its own. Definitely am just hoping individuals out there realize the threat here and really take a little bit of time to dig into whether direct send is really needed in your organization.
Yeah, good call out there. Now, Hayden, we saw credential exposure being the top digital risk protection alert across sectors, which I don't think is a huge surprise given the trend that we're seeing in attackers going after valid accounts. But were there any DRP trends that you saw that were less frequent but are worth calling out?
Yeah, so there was a few that stood out with each specific sector. So first one being the utilities sector. So from there with our DRP alerts, we actually saw exposed or open ports being at 2% for that sector, which was actually the highest out of the rest of them, which makes a lot of sense kind of thinking about it. With the utilities, you may have remote access to these locations that are, of course, like just in remote areas, and more of that convergence of OT and IT at the same time. And we actually have a report that goes a little bit more in depth with this. That one's called Scale Up, Risk Up. DRP data reveals an increase in attack surface. So that one we actually go into what specific ports we were actually seeing. So at that time, it was specific OT ports were pretty prominent, such as like 502 with Modbus or 20256 for Unitronics. And then the next sector that stood out with an interesting DRP data was public administration. Again, this one makes sense. So the alert itself is marked document. So that was actually 5%. And again, it makes sense with public administration. You're dealing with large amounts of data. You're using legacy systems, possibly. You may have even like legacy procedures and processes. And with that alert type marked document, what that is any sort of sensitive document that we see exposed out there that may say, an organization's name, confidential, internal use only, things like that. And what we've actually seen, one of the most common places those are actually uploaded are organizations' websites themselves, just on the back end, possibly not even thinking that they're going to be indexed by Google as well. From there, manufacturing, they had evidence of credential access being at 1%, which was actually the highest out of the other sectors in this reporting period. And with that alert type, that is for like your information stealing malware. So for those that don't know, if a system gets infected by this family of malware, its main goal is just to exfiltrate credentials from it, such as like credentials stored in the browser, and sell them on marketplaces such as the Russian market. And then with manufacturing, they actually were the most prominent with this. And I would say there's no clear smoking gun with this one, in my opinion, but I previously worked in IT in manufacturing, and not saying this about the organization I worked at, but I would say there was less device sort of based controls I've seen in this sort of sector, such as like you deal with weird software all the time, and it's all about keeping uptime on the plant floor. So you just kind of enable stuff, let it run, and you don't want things to stop. So possibly it could be just people, sitting on the factory floor, maybe in the shipping department downloading this. So that's just my guess, but I don't think there's really a smoking gun on that one personally. And then in a similar sort of note, finance and insurance industry, they had exposed access keys at 5%. Again, I don't know if there's a clear reason for this. So that's being like your API keys, things like that being exposed. It could possibly be with this sector having to do with a lot of customer data. You have PII records, things like that, and you have a very extensive use of like backend APIs in your customer facing websites where this data has to be, pulled from as far as on the back end with these API keys. Again, that's kind of my guess with it, but these were just some interesting observations we had from each sector.
Yeah, different dependencies within the types of organizations that are operating in these sectors makes it difficult to interpret, but also makes it difficult to tackle some of the most common cyber threats we see.
I'm glad you brought up API keys because it's something that we are working on, and we're working on with most vendors out there, is API key security, right? Like, can you limit the permissions of an API key? If not, then maybe you need to reach out to those vendors and be like, hey, I don't need a full admin with read-write permissions assigned to this API key. Like, you only need to read from this one directory. So can I limit the permissions? And also, can I put a IP restriction in place? So in order for this API key to be this authentication to occur, it needs to come from like a specific IP address. So I think that's something that we're going to continue to see being improved as we go, is API key security, because at the end of the day, these are kind of keys to the kingdom. So yeah, work with vendors out there if you identify issues with permissions, and then being able to scope down where those requests are coming from.
To wrap up then, Hayden, what would be your top takeaway and your top piece of advice for anyone tackling cyber threats, regardless of sector?
Yeah, so I have a few, and one of them I believe Corey kind of stole my notes from. He actually hit on it very well. So on the DRP sort of space, starting with that, like we already mentioned with those API keys, again, like trying to restrict the permissions on them, rotate them regularly if you can. Another one I had to add on top of it was try to avoid hard coding it as well where you can, be able to kind of limit the risk of that being exposed. And moving on to other ones, so reviewing your public facing footprint as far as even like your own website, as far as like confidential documents go, there could be some useful insights in there, maybe some internal processes, maybe even credentials on the document itself that could be leveraged by attackers throughout their targeting and OSINT process before they actually, start going after organizations. And on those exposed ports, so again, auditing that public facing footprint, removing any unnecessary exposed ports that you have. And to wrap it up, as far as what we talked about earlier with like your on-premise or ransomware attacks, just ensure that the devices connecting to your network, such as like your VPN portal, are actually authorized. So try to leverage things such as like device-based certificates if you can. Ensuring EDR is deployed across the whole environment. We see a lot of these ransomware operators will gain access to some hosts where they are able to operate freely, where it's actually not deployed sometimes, and making sure that's actually set to block threats as opposed to just detect as well. To Corey's point earlier, just to stop things in their tracks as much as we can. And last thing I just wanted to hit on was, again, securing those service accounts to be able to kind of limit their ability to get quick privileges to be able to attack the whole environment.
Yeah, let us know what your experience at home is. Do you work in a niche sector and struggle with niche cyber threats, or is what we're talking about today really reflective of what's going on in your environment? Give us an email at shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. And both the blogs that Hayden mentioned throughout this part of the podcast will be available in our link tree, as well as all of the other resources for today's episode. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions for us to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcasting platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen to us. It'll make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk, your weekly cybersecurity news and threat research podcast made for practitioners by practitioners.